So I always find that when studying Islamic history, people are always confused on what the Caliph is, and it's always difficult to explain to people that don't know. And so I've hoped that this video will be helpful to those who don't know what the Caliph is, and especially for those who are trying to explain it to others. Hopefully there will be people just sending this video to people. As a disclaimer, because I am a Muslim, I will be referring to what people might ordinarily, the person that people will ordinarily refer to as just Muhammad. I'll be calling him the Prophet. So the Prophet had a dual role, as many will know. He was a spiritual leader and helped guide his community on moral matters. He created essentially laws, or pray 5 times a day, fast during Ramadan. He sent out these obligations as a spiritual leader that weren't exactly really forced, backed up by the law. But he was also what someone might call a temporal ruler, in that he was the head of a state. He ran the government. He ran, his own government. He appointed people to collect taxes, lead armies, and all that stuff. And so he had these 2 different roles. So when the Prophet died, no one inherited his spiritual, or from the Sunni perspective, nobody really inherited his spiritual role. To a limited extent, the Shias might say that the Imams were some sort of a spiritual successor, but not to nearly the same magnitude, but still kind of a spiritual successor. But then there were temporal successors, which generally the Sunni and the Shia agree, and Ibadis even I believe agree, are the Caliphs, or Caliph, or literally I believe means successor in Arabic. And so the Caliphs are supposed to be the head, the leaders of the Islamic community, right? And that's what the person after the Prophet, Abu Bakr, that's what he did. He organized the Muslims during the Rida Wars and helped consolidate the government and explain what Muslims are supposed to be without the Prophet, which earlier people didn't really have to think about. And so the Caliph position developed as the leader of the Muslim community, especially since they were surrounded by enemies, or at least surrounded by perceived enemies, right? There was the Rida Wars, and after that, there were still fears about Byzantine or Sassanid invasion. And even after the Byzantines and the Sassanids were defeated, there were still threats like Turkic raids, and just keeping the country together. That made people feel like they still, and also just because people want leadership to govern things and keep the world together. The Caliph position still existed, but the Caliphs, especially after the Rashidun with the Umayyads, who were in many ways quite considered illegitimate, the Caliphs never really had spiritual authority. The only time they really tried to exert spiritual authority beyond the clergy was the Mihna during the Abbasids, where a specific sect of Muslims were most of Islamic thought, the Mutazilites, were promoted over other schools of Islamic thought, and many Muslims and especially scholars were imprisoned and punished for deviating from what became the state-sanctioned sect, that being the Mutazilites. But later, this persecution, the Mihna, it was called, this persecution would be lifted, and the Islamic world would again become relatively open in discussion about what Islam was, that being fiqh and general theology. So the caliphs were more temporal leaders. If you're a Muslim, you knew you could look to the caliph, but the caliph position became more ceremonial, especially with the decline of the Abbasids and their subjugation by the Buyids and then the Seljuks. After all of that, the Caliph became more nominal and ceremonial, especially since the Abbasids were confined to just Iraq, and after the Mongols just became a propaganda tool of the Mamluks, and the Ottomans would later take on the title of Caliph, again as like a propaganda piece. And even the and there was also the story spread, which I believe these days is considered to have been like false apocryphal, that the Abbasid caliphs abdicated their position to the Ottomans. But even then, the Ottomans only really used the position to influence other Muslims, and not in like a spiritual way, just in a very from a political perspective. And so the Ottomans were able to exert political, like some sort of political influence over places like Pakistan, even the Philippines, where they dissuaded Muslim Filipinos from rising up against the Americans, I believe. So yeah, so TLDR, the Caliph is just supposed to be the political leader of the Muslims. They're supposed to give the Muslims guidance on what to do, politically wise, in terms of foreign, I guess you could say like foreign policy, like just where the Muslim community stands in the world. But after the disintegration of the Caliphate, with the Abbasids losing power and just being confined to Iraq and becoming puppets of other governments, the Caliph position lost a lot of its prestige and practical authority. And in a Muslim world that is, in our current Islamic world, the countries are a lot smaller than they used to be. So it doesn't really make sense for one of them to be Caliph. And the Caliph position is also basically meaningless without an actual like army to back it up, because it's supposed to be a political leader. How can a government exercise any real influence without an actual state to back it up? So the Caliph position has been rendered void. Thank you for listening.